Some words carry more weight than others. Some moments change everything in an instant. For Kate Morrison, two simple words spoken during a Christmas carol service would transform not just her holiday season, but her entire understanding of gratitude, community, and the power of human connection. What started as reluctant attendance at a small-town church service became a journey that would touch dozens of lives and create ripples of kindness that spread far beyond anyone's imagination. This is the true story of how one woman's unexpected thank you during Silent Night became the catalyst for a Christmas miracle that reminded an entire community what the season is really about. Kate Morrison had always been the type of person who preferred to keep to herself. At 42, she had built a comfortable life in the small town of Millbrook, working as a librarian and living in a modest apartment above the old bookstore on Main Street. She had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier after her divorce, seeking the kind of quiet anonymity that small towns could provide to those who didn't want to be noticed. The December morning, when everything changed, started like any other. Kate woke to the sound of snow gently tapping against her bedroom window. The town was preparing for Christmas, and everywhere she looked, there were reminders of the approaching holiday. Red and green lights twinkled from storefronts, wreaths hung on doors, and the local radio station had switched to its annual all-Christmas music format that would continue until New Year's Day. Kate had mixed feelings about Christmas. It wasn't that she disliked the holiday exactly, but it reminded her of everything she had lost. The Christmases with her ex-husband David had been elaborate affairs, filled with expensive gifts, dinner parties, and all the trappings of their upper-middle-class lifestyle in the city. After the divorce, those memories felt more like wounds than warm recollections. Christmas now meant being alone, eating a frozen dinner, and watching old movies until she fell asleep on her couch. As she walked to work that morning, her breath visible in small puffs of white vapor, Kate noticed Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop hanging garland around her storefront. The elderly woman waved enthusiastically, as she did every morning, and called out her usual greeting. "Good morning, Kate, dear. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Kate managed a small smile and a nod, quickening her pace. She appreciated Mrs. Henderson's kindness, but she wasn't ready for the kind of friendship the older woman seemed eager to offer. It was safer to keep people at a distance. Relationships, Kate had learned, had a way of disappointing you just when you needed them most. The library was Kate's sanctuary. Built in 1897, the brick building had tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and the comforting smell of old books and furniture polish. As the head librarian, Kate had transformed it into exactly the kind of place she wanted to spend her days. It was organized, predictable, and peaceful. She knew where everything belonged, and, more importantly, she could help people find what they were looking for without having to share much about herself. That particular Tuesday was busier than usual. The elementary school had brought a group of third graders for story time, and Kate found herself reading The Polar Express to 28 excited children who hung on every word. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and for a brief moment, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, pure joy in sharing something beautiful with others. After the children left, chattering excitedly about Christmas and presents and whether they believed in Santa Claus, the library settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. Kate was reshelving books in the children's section when she overheard a conversation between two patrons that would plant the first seed of what was to come. Mrs. Patterson, who volunteered at the local food bank, was talking to Jim Martinez, who owned the hardware store. They were discussing the upcoming Christmas carol service at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, the small stone church that sat at the corner of Main and Elm Streets. "Father William asked if I could help organize the service this year," Mrs. Patterson was saying. "We're hoping to make it special. It's been such a difficult year for so many families in town." Kate knew what she meant. The small manufacturing plant that had employed nearly a quarter of the town had closed in September, leaving many families struggling just before the holidays. She had seen the impact at the library, where more people were using the computers to search for jobs online, and where the demand for books had increased among people who couldn't afford other forms of entertainment. "What kind of help do you need?" Jim asked. "Well, we need people to help with decorations, someone to coordinate refreshments afterward, and honestly, we just need a good turnout. Last year we barely had 30 people, and most of them were over 70. We're hoping to reach some of the younger families, maybe some of the people who are going through tough times. Sometimes a little community spirit is exactly what people need." Kate found herself lingering in the children's section longer than necessary, listening to their conversation. She had walked past St. Mary's hundreds of times, but had never been inside. Religion had never been a significant part of her life, and after her divorce, she had questioned whether there was any point to faith at all. If there was a God, why did good people suffer? Why did marriages fail despite everyone's best efforts? Why did life seem to disappoint more often than it delivered on its promises? But something about Mrs. Patterson's words stuck with her. A little community spirit is exactly what people need. Kate couldn't help but wonder what that might feel like. Later that afternoon, as she was preparing to close the library, Kate noticed a small flyer that someone had left on the main information desk. It was a simple announcement about the Christmas carol service, decorated with hand-drawn holly leaves and printed on green paper. The date was December 20th, just 2 weeks away. The time was 7 p.m. The message at the bottom read, "All are welcome. Come as you are." Kate stared at the flyer for a long moment. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's words, about the struggling families in town, about the children who had listened so intently to the Polar Express that morning. She thought about her own loneliness, which had become as familiar as her morning coffee, but no less bitter. Before she could change her mind, Kate folded the flyer and slipped it into her purse. That evening, Kate sat in her small living room with a cup of tea, looking out at the snow that had begun falling more heavily. The flyer lay on her coffee table, and she found herself reading it again and again. Come as you are. What did that even mean? She was a divorced woman in her 40s who had essentially given up on connecting with other people. She was someone who preferred books to people and silence to small talk. Was that really who she wanted to be? The next few days passed in their usual routine, but Kate found herself paying more attention to the preparations happening around town. She noticed the volunteers hanging lights on the church, saw Mrs. Henderson donating poinsettias from her flower shop, observed families walking together down the sidewalks, bundled against the cold but talking and laughing as they went. On Friday afternoon, a week before the carol service, something happened that would push Kate toward a decision she wasn't even sure she was ready to make. She was working at the circulation desk when a young mother came in with her 2 small children. Kate recognized them as the Johnsons. Mark Johnson had lost his job at the plant, and his wife Sarah was working double shifts at the diner to try to make ends meet. Sarah looked exhausted as she approached the desk with an armful of books to return. Her children, a boy of about 6 and a girl of maybe 4, stayed close to her side, unusually quiet for children their age. "Hi, Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said softly. "We need to return these, and I was wondering if there are any Christmas books available for the kids." Kate looked at the children, who were looking longingly toward the decorated Christmas tree in the children's section. Their clothes were clean but clearly hand-me-downs, and she noticed that their shoes were worn thin. The little girl was clutching a small, well-loved stuffed rabbit. "Of course," Kate said, coming around from behind the desk. "Let's go see what we can find." As they walked toward the children's section, the little girl tugged on Kate's sweater. When Kate looked down, the child smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you." Something in that simple expression of gratitude hit Kate harder than she expected. This child, whose family was clearly struggling, who probably wouldn't have much of a Christmas this year, was thanking her for something as simple as helping her find a book to read. Kate spent the next 20 minutes helping the children select books, watching their faces light up as they discovered stories about Christmas magic, Santa's workshop, and families celebrating together. When they left, Sarah turned back and said, "You know, Mrs. Morrison, you've always been so kind to my kids. We really appreciate having you here." That night, Kate sat with a flyer again, but this time she was thinking about something different. She was thinking about the little girl's thank you, about Sarah's tired smile, about the third graders who had listened so intently to her reading. She was thinking about Mrs. Patterson's words about community spirit and about the simple invitation printed at the bottom of the green flyer. Come as you are. Maybe, Kate thought, it was time to find out what that really meant. The next morning, Saturday, Kate woke with an unusual sense of purpose. She made her coffee, sat at her small kitchen table, and made a list. It was something she did when she needed to organize her thoughts, a habit left over from her previous life when she had been the kind of person who planned dinner parties and managed social calendars. At the top of the page, she wrote, Christmas Carol Service, December 20th. Below that, she began writing the reasons she should go and the reasons she should stay home. The second list was longer and more familiar. She didn't know anyone well enough to sit with them. She didn't have anything appropriate to wear. She hadn't been to church in years and would probably do something wrong. People might ask her questions she didn't want to answer. It would be awkward and uncomfortable and probably a mistake. But the first list, though shorter, carried more weight than she expected. She was curious about what it would be like to be part of something bigger than herself. She wanted to understand what Mrs. Patterson meant about community spirit. She kept thinking about the Johnson children and wondering if they would be there. And somewhere, buried deeper than she was ready to admit, she was tired of spending every evening alone with only her thoughts for company. Kate looked at her lists for a long time. Then, with the kind of sudden decisiveness that surprised even her, she tore up the paper and threw the pieces in the trash. She was going to the Christmas Carol service. The decision, once made, brought with it a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that Kate hadn't felt in years. She spent the rest of Saturday cleaning her apartment, as if preparing for the carol service required putting her entire life in order. She organized her closets, dusted furniture that was already clean, and rearranged her bookshelves by author and then by color, and then back to author again. By Sunday, she was second-guessing herself. What had seemed like a reasonable idea on Saturday morning felt increasingly foolish as the week progressed. She didn't know the songs they would sing. She didn't know when to stand or sit or what to do with her hands. She had spent so long being on the outside of community life that she had forgotten how to be part of it. But every time she considered backing out, she thought about the little girl's thank you and found herself unable to abandon the plan entirely. Instead, she began to prepare as if it were a research project, which was something she understood. She borrowed a book about Christmas carols from the library's collection and spent her evenings learning about their history and meaning. She looked up St. Mary's Episcopal Church online and read about their history and their current programs. What she discovered surprised her. The church had been serving the community for over a century, but their focus seemed to be less on preaching and more on helping. They ran the food bank that Mrs. Patterson had mentioned. They provided after-school tutoring for children whose parents worked late. They had a program that delivered meals to elderly residents who couldn't get out easily. They seemed to be the kind of people who believed that faith was something you did rather than something you simply believed. As December 20th approached, Kate found herself looking forward to the carol service with an anticipation she hadn't felt about a social event in years. She chose her outfit carefully, a dark blue dress that was nice enough for church, but not so formal that she would stand out, low-heeled shoes that wouldn't make noise on the old wooden floors, and her mother's pearl earrings, which she hadn't worn since the funeral 3 years earlier. The morning of the carol service dawned clear and cold, with the kind of bright winter sunshine that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Kate worked at the library as usual, but found it difficult to concentrate. Every time she looked at the clock, her stomach fluttered with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of being a child on Christmas morning. As closing time approached, Kate realized that for the first time in 5 years, she had somewhere to go on a winter evening that wasn't her empty apartment. For the first time since her divorce, she was about to walk into a room full of people with the intention of being part of whatever was happening there. It was a small step, but for Kate Morrison, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. At exactly 6:45 that evening, Kate stood across the street from St. Mary's Episcopal Church, watching people arrive for the carol service. The small stone building glowed warmly from within, and she could see figures moving around inside, preparing for the evening. Golden light spilled from the tall, stained glass windows, creating colorful patches on the snow-covered ground. Kate had walked past this church hundreds of times, but she had never really looked at it before. Built in the Gothic Revival style, it had a steep slate roof, pointed arch windows, and a bell tower that reached toward the winter sky. Ivy climbed the walls, and snow had gathered in the carved stone details around the doorway. It looked like something from a Christmas card, peaceful and welcoming. But standing there in the cold, Kate felt her earlier confidence beginning to waver. Through the windows, she could see families arriving together, people greeting each other with hugs and warm smiles, children running up and down the center aisle while their parents chatted with friends. It looked like exactly the kind of close-knit community gathering that Kate had been avoiding for the past 5 years. A couple walked past her, heading toward the church entrance, and Kate recognized them as the owners of the local bakery. They nodded politely and continued on their way, and Kate realized she had been standing in the same spot for nearly 10 minutes, working up the courage to cross the street. Just as she was beginning to consider going home, she saw a familiar figure approaching from down the block. It was Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop, walking slowly with the help of a wooden cane and carrying what appeared to be a covered dish. When she spotted Kate, her face broke into a delighted smile. "Kate, dear, how wonderful to see you here. Are you coming to the carol service?" There was no backing out now. Kate crossed the street to meet Mrs. Henderson, offering to carry the dish, which turned out to be homemade cookies for the reception afterward. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Kate admitted as they walked toward the church entrance together. "I've never been to anything like this before." Mrs. Henderson stopped walking and looked at Kate with kind, understanding eyes. "Oh, my dear, there's no wrong way to do this. Father William always says that church is for people who need it, not for people who have it all figured out. And honestly, none of us have it all figured out anyway." As they approached the heavy wooden doors, Kate could hear the sound of voices and laughter from inside. Mrs. Henderson paused before opening the door and turned to Kate with a gentle smile. "You know, I've been hoping you might join us for something like this. You've been so kind to me whenever I see you on Main Street, but you always seem a little sad. Maybe tonight will be good for both of us." The comment caught Kate off guard. She hadn't realized that her sadness was so visible, or that someone like Mrs. Henderson, who barely knew her, had been thinking about her well-being. It was both touching and slightly embarrassing to realize that her carefully constructed solitude hadn't hidden her loneliness as well as she had thought. The moment they stepped inside, Kate was enveloped by warmth, both literal and figurative. The interior of the church was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The walls were pale stone, and wooden beams stretched across the vaulted ceiling. Candles flickered on the windowsills and along the altar, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The pews were decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon, and a simple but elegant Christmas tree stood near the front, decorated with white lights and homemade ornaments. But it was the people that made the biggest impression on Kate. The church was fuller than she had expected, with families spread throughout the pews, elderly couples sitting hand in hand, teenagers texting on their phones while their parents chatted with neighbors. She recognized faces from around town. The postmaster, several teachers from the elementary school, the young couple who ran the coffee shop, and many others whose names she didn't know, but whose faces were familiar from her daily walks through Millbrook. Mrs. Patterson spotted them immediately and hurried over, her face lighting up when she saw Kate. "Oh, how wonderful that you could come. Mrs. Henderson, thank you so much for bringing cookies. Kate, I'm so glad you decided to join us. Let me introduce you to Father William." Before Kate could protest, she found herself being led toward the front of the church, where a tall, thin man with graying hair and a warm smile was talking with a group of choir members. Father William looked to be in his early 60s, with laugh lines around his eyes, and the kind of presence that immediately put people at ease. "Father William, this is Kate Morrison, our librarian," Mrs. Patterson said. It's her first time joining us for a carol service. Father William's face broke into a genuine smile as he extended his hand. Kate, how wonderful to meet you properly. I've been hoping to run into you around town for years. The library is one of my favorite places in Millbrook. Thank you so much for all you do for our community. Kate was surprised by his words. She had never thought of her work at the library as doing something for the community. To her, it was simply her job, a way to pay the bills while maintaining the kind of quiet, predictable life she preferred. But hearing Father William describe it that way made her see her daily routine in a different light. I hope you'll feel comfortable here tonight, Father William continued. We're a pretty informal group, and everyone is welcome to participate as much or as little as they'd like. Some people love to sing along with everything. Others prefer to listen. There's no wrong way to experience this. As Mrs. Patterson led Kate to a pew about halfway up the aisle, Kate found herself looking around at the other attendees with new eyes. She had expected to feel out of place, like an obvious outsider in a gathering of longtime friends. Instead, she noticed that many people seemed to be attending alone, and that there were several faces she didn't recognize at all. A young woman with two small children sat by herself near the front. An elderly man she had never seen before was reading through the program by himself. Three teenagers who looked like they might be visiting from out of town sat together in the back row. Maybe, Kate thought, feeling out of place was more common than she had realized. Maybe everyone felt a little uncertain sometimes about where they belonged. Just before 7 o'clock, as the last stragglers found their seats, Kate noticed the Johnson family entering the church. Sarah looked less tired than she had at the library, and the children were wearing what were clearly their best clothes. The little girl was still carrying her stuffed rabbit, and when she spotted Kate, she waved enthusiastically. Kate waved back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heated church building. Father William moved to the front of the church and raised his hands for attention. The conversations gradually died down, and a peaceful quiet settled over the gathering. Welcome, everyone, to our annual Christmas carol service, he began, his voice carrying easily through the small church. I see many familiar faces tonight, and several new ones as well, which makes my heart especially happy. Christmas is a time for coming together, for remembering what connects us to one another, and for celebrating the light that exists in our community even during the darkest days of the year. He paused, looking out over the congregation with obvious affection. Tonight, we're going to sing some of the songs that have brought comfort and joy to people for generations. Some of you know every word by heart. Others are hearing these carols for the first time. That's perfectly fine. Music has a way of speaking to us whether we know the words or not. Kate felt herself relaxing as Father William spoke. His manner was conversational and warm, nothing like the formal, intimidating church services she had imagined. This felt more like a community gathering that happened to be taking place in a church, rather than a religious service that outsiders wouldn't understand. The carol service began with "O come, all ye faithful," and Kate was surprised by how full and rich the sound was when the entire congregation joined in. She had expected tentative, uncertain singing, but instead she heard voices of all ages blending together in harmony. Mrs. Henderson, sitting beside her, had a surprisingly strong soprano voice. The teenager in front of her was singing bass in a voice that seemed too deep for his slight frame. The Johnson children were singing enthusiastically, if not entirely on key. Kate didn't know all the words, but she found herself humming along, swept up in the collective sound of the community singing together. There was something powerful about being part of that chorus of voices, about adding her own small contribution to something bigger than herself. As the evening progressed, Kate found herself paying attention to more than just the music. She noticed how Mrs. Patterson quietly helped an elderly man find the right page in his hymnal. She saw Father William nod encouragingly toward a young mother whose baby was fussing softly during one of the songs. She watched the Johnson children lean against their mother during the quieter carols, clearly content to be there despite their family's financial struggles. Between songs, Father William would share brief stories about the history of each carol or read a short passage about the meaning of Christmas. His words were simple and thoughtful, focusing on themes of hope, community, and the importance of caring for one another. Kate found herself thinking about her own life, about the wall she had built around herself, and about the price of the safety she had sought in her solitude. During Silent Night, something shifted for Kate. The song began with just Father William's voice, clear and gentle in the candlelit church. Gradually, other voices joined in until the entire congregation was singing together in soft harmony. The children's voices blended with those of their grandparents. The teenagers sang alongside the shop owners and teachers, and for a few minutes, all the different people in that small church became one unified voice. Kate found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to that moment. 6 months earlier, she wouldn't have imagined herself sitting in a church pew, surrounded by her neighbors, feeling genuinely moved by a Christmas carol. 6 months earlier, she was still convinced that keeping to herself was the safest and smartest way to live. But as she listened to the voices around her, as she watched the faces illuminated by candlelight, as she felt the warmth of Mrs. Henderson beside her, and saw the Johnson children singing with such pure joy, Kate realized something important was happening inside her. The walls she had built around her heart weren't protecting her anymore. They were just keeping her isolated from exactly the kind of human connection she had been craving without even knowing it. As Silent Night drew to a close, Kate felt tears gathering in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, exactly, but rather tears of recognition. She was recognizing herself as someone who belonged here, someone who was part of this community whether she had admitted it or not. She was recognizing the faces around her as neighbors and friends rather than strangers to be avoided. And in that moment of recognition, something inside Kate shifted permanently. The carol service wasn't just a pleasant way to spend an evening. It was the beginning of her return to the world of human connection. The first step back toward the person she used to be before life had taught her to be afraid of caring too much. The evening wasn't over yet, and Kate didn't know what would happen next. But sitting in that candlelit church, surrounded by the voices of her community, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. As the final notes of Silent Night faded away, Father William stepped forward once again. The church remained quiet for a long moment, as if everyone wanted to hold on to the peace and beauty of what they had just shared. Candlelight continued to flicker against the stone walls, and Kate could hear the soft sound of snow tapping against the stained glass windows. Before we close this evening, Father William said softly, "I'd like to invite anyone who feels moved to do so to share a word or two about what this Christmas season means to them. Sometimes, hearing from one another can remind us of blessings we might have forgotten or help us see our own lives through different eyes." Kate felt a flutter of panic at the suggestion. The last thing she wanted was to be put on the spot or expected to speak in front of all these people. But as she looked around, she realized that Father William's invitation was genuinely optional. Several people remained seated, looking comfortable and content to listen. There was no pressure, no expectation that everyone would participate. Mrs. Patterson was the first to stand. "I just want to say how grateful I am to see so many faces here tonight, especially some new ones." Her eyes briefly met Kate's, and she smiled warmly. "This has been a difficult year for many families in our town, and it means so much to me to see us all coming together like this. Christmas reminds me that we're not meant to face our challenges alone." A few other people shared brief thoughts. The young mother with the fussy baby spoke about finding joy in small moments. One of the teenagers mentioned how much he appreciated having a place to come where he felt accepted. An elderly woman talked about the comfort of traditions that connect us across generations. Then, to Kate's surprise, Sarah Johnson stood up slowly, still holding her daughter on her hip. Kate could see that she was nervous, but there was something determined in her expression. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," Sarah began, her voice quiet but clear. "But my family has been going through a really hard time since my husband lost his job. There have been days when I wondered how we were going to make it through, especially with Christmas coming. She paused, looking down at her children, who were listening intently. But being here tonight, surrounded by all of you, reminds me that we're not alone. And my children have been teaching me about gratitude in ways I never expected. Just this week, my daughter thanked Mrs. Morrison at the library for helping her find books to read. And it reminded me that even when things are difficult, there are still people who care about us. Kate felt her heart skip a beat as Sarah continued. So I want to say thank you to everyone who has made this Christmas possible for my family. Thank you to Mrs. Morrison for always being so kind to my children. Thank you to Mrs. Henderson for the flowers you brought by last week. Thank you to everyone at the food bank and to Father William for always having an open door. Sometimes thank you is the only gift we have to give, but it comes from the heart. As Sarah sat down, Kate felt tears gathering in her eyes again. She thought about the little girl's simple thank you at the library, about how those 2 words had started her on the path that led to this moment. She thought about Sarah's courage in standing up and speaking honestly about her family struggles. And she thought about the community of people around her who had been quietly supporting the Johnson family and others like them. Before she fully realized what she was doing, Kate found herself standing up. The church grew quiet, and Kate could feel all eyes turning toward her. Her heart was racing, and for a moment, she considered sitting back down and pretending she had just been adjusting her position. But something inside her, something that had been awakened during the course of the evening, kept her on her feet. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm not very good at this. I haven't spoken in front of a group of people in years." A few understanding murmurs rippled through the congregation, and Kate saw several people nodding encouragingly. Father William smiled at her warmly, and Mrs. Henderson reached over to give her hand a gentle squeeze. Kate took a deep breath and continued. "I moved to Millbrook 5 years ago, and I thought I wanted to be left alone. I thought that keeping to myself was the safest way to live, especially after my divorce. I convinced myself that I didn't need community or friends or any of the complications that come with caring about other people." She paused, looking around at the faces that had become familiar to her over the past 2 hours. "But tonight, sitting here with all of you, singing these beautiful songs together, I realize how much I've been missing. I've been so focused on protecting myself from getting hurt that I forgot about all the good things that come from being connected to other people." Kate's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Sarah, what you said about your daughter thanking me at the library, that moment changed something for me. It reminded me that even small acts of kindness matter, and that we're all connected to each other in ways we might not even realize. Your daughter's simple thank you made me want to be the kind of person who deserves that gratitude." She looked directly at the Johnson family, seeing the little girl nestled against her mother's shoulder, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. "So, I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for welcoming me here tonight, even though I've spent 5 years keeping everyone at a distance. Thank you for showing me what community really means. And thank you for reminding me that Christmas isn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It's about showing up for each other, especially when things are difficult." Kate sat down quickly, her heart still racing, but feeling lighter than she had in years. The church was quiet for a moment, and then she heard soft applause spreading throughout the congregation. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a gentle acknowledgement of what she had shared. Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand again and whispered, "That was beautiful, dear. Thank you for sharing that with us." Father William stepped forward once more, his eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you to everyone who shared tonight. These are the moments that remind us what Christmas is really about, not the presents or the decorations, but the ways we connect with and care for each other." He raised his hands, and the congregation stood for the final carol of the evening. Let's close with "Joy to the World," celebrating the light that exists in this community and in each of our hearts. As the familiar melody filled the church, Kate sang along with more confidence than she had felt all evening. The words seemed to carry new meaning now, not just as a traditional Christmas song, but as a celebration of the joy that comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. When the final notes faded away, people began moving around the church, chatting and making their way toward the reception area in the parish hall next door. But before Kate could follow the crowd, she found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk with her. The young mother with the baby approached first. "I'm Jennifer, and this is Emma," she said, indicating the baby in her arms. "I just want to say how much I appreciated what you shared tonight. I'm new to town too, and it's not easy to find your place in a new community." They were joined by Jim Martinez from the hardware store, who shook Kate's hand warmly. "I've seen you around town for years, but never got a chance to properly introduce myself. Thank you for speaking tonight. It takes courage to be that honest in front of a group." One by one, people introduced themselves to Kate, sharing their own stories of finding community in Millbrook or struggling with loneliness or simply expressing appreciation for her willingness to be vulnerable. Kate realized that her assumption about being the only outsider in the room had been completely wrong. Many of these people had their own stories of starting over, of finding their way back to connection after loss or disappointment. The Johnson children approached with their parents, and the little girl shyly offered Kate a small candy cane from her pocket. "Thank you for the books," she whispered, the same words that had started Kate's journey toward this moment. "Thank you for being such a good reader," Kate replied, kneeling down to the child's level. "I hope you'll come visit me at the library again soon." As the crowd around her dispersed, Kate found herself walking toward the parish hall with Mrs. Henderson, who was beaming with pride as if Kate were her own granddaughter. "You know, dear," Mrs. Henderson said as they walked, "I've been hoping for 5 years that you might find your way into our community. Tonight, watching you speak, seeing how people responded to you, I think you finally have." The parish hall was decorated with more pine boughs and twinkling lights, and tables were laden with homemade cookies, hot cider, and coffee. The atmosphere was warm and festive, with people of all ages mingling and enjoying the simple pleasure of being together on a winter evening. Kate found herself in conversation after conversation, learning names and stories, discovering connections she had never noticed before. The woman who cleaned the church on weekends turned out to be the mother of one of the children who came to story time in the library. The elderly man she hadn't recognized was Mrs. Henderson's brother, visiting from the next town over. The teenagers in the back row were home from college and eager to reconnect with the community they had grown up in. As the evening wound down and people began putting on their coats and saying their goodbyes, Kate realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with Millbrook. She was no longer an observer of small-town life, watching from a distance while others participated in community events. She had become a participant herself, someone with connections and relationships, someone who belonged. Father William approached her as she was preparing to leave. "Kate, I can't tell you how much your words meant to everyone tonight. Sometimes it takes one person's honesty to give others permission to be honest too. I think you started something important here." Kate wasn't sure what he meant, but she thanked him for his kindness and for creating the kind of environment where she had felt safe enough to speak. As she walked toward the door, she found herself making plans to come back, not just for special events, but for regular Sunday services. She wanted to learn more about this community she had discovered, and she wanted to find ways to contribute to the good work she had seen happening. Mrs. Henderson walked home with her, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow as they made their way down Main Street. The town looked different to Kate now, more like home and less like a place she was just passing through. She could see lights in the windows of houses where she now knew some of the people who lived inside. She could imagine herself becoming a regular at community events, someone others would greet by name and include in their conversations. "Thank you for encouraging me to come tonight," Kate told Mrs. Henderson as they reached the flower shop. "I almost didn't make it through the door." Mrs. Henderson smiled and patted Kate's arm. "Oh, my dear, you would have found your way here eventually. Some people are meant to be part of a community, no matter how hard they try to convince themselves otherwise. Tonight was just the right time for you to remember who you really are." As Kate climbed the stairs to her apartment above the bookstore, she thought about Mrs. Henderson's words, who she really was. For 5 years, she had defined herself by what she wasn't. Not married anymore, not part of a couple, not someone who needed other people. But tonight had reminded her of what she actually was, someone who cared deeply about others, someone who had something valuable to contribute, someone who belonged. She looked out her window at the church, where a few lights were still on, as volunteers cleaned up from the evening. Tomorrow, she decided she was going to start finding ways to get more involved in the community that had welcomed her so warmly. She was going to stop being afraid of connection and start embracing the possibilities that came with truly belonging somewhere. The Christmas Carol service was over, but for Kate Morrison, it felt like the real celebration was just beginning. The days following the Christmas Carol service brought changes to Kate's life that she couldn't have anticipated. She woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose and energy that she hadn't felt in years. Instead of her usual quiet Saturday routine of reading and organizing her apartment, Kate found herself thinking about the conversation from the night before and the connections she had made. Over breakfast, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She was going to actively look for ways to become more involved in the community that had welcomed her so warmly. But she wanted to do more than just attend events. She wanted to find a way to contribute something meaningful, to give back to the place that had helped her remember who she really was. Her first stop was the church. Kate had never visited St. Mary's during daylight hours, and she was curious to see what it looked like when it wasn't glowing with candlelight and filled with people. She found Father William in the church office, a small room behind the sanctuary filled with books, papers, and what appeared to be several different Christmas decoration storage boxes. Kate, Father William looked up from his desk with genuine pleasure. What a wonderful surprise. How are you feeling after last night? Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, Kate said, taking the chair he offered. I've been thinking about what you said about starting something important. I want to find a way to help, to be more involved in whatever good work is happening here. Father William leaned back in his chair, studying Kate with interest. What kinds of things are you drawn to? We have lots of opportunities for people to get involved, depending on their interests and abilities. Kate had given this some thought during her walkover. Well, I'm a librarian, so I'm good with books and organizing information. I'm also good with children. They seem to respond well to me during story time. And after talking with people last night, I keep thinking about families like the Johnsons, people who are struggling but try to maintain their dignity. That's interesting, Father Williams said thoughtfully. Actually, Mrs. Patterson and I have been talking about expanding our food bank program, maybe adding some educational components or family activities. People need more than just food assistance. They need community support and ways to feel connected rather than just like they're receiving charity. Kate felt a spark of excitement as Father William continued. What if we created some kind of program that combined food assistance with family activities? Maybe reading programs for children or workshops for parents, or even just social events that bring families together in a way that feels supportive rather than stigmatizing. The more they talked, the more Kate's enthusiasm grew. Here was a way to use her skills as a librarian while also addressing the deeper issues of isolation and community support that she had experienced herself. She could help create something that would provide practical assistance while also building the kind of connections that had made such a difference in her own life. I'd love to work on this, Kate said. When could we start? Father William smiled. How about next week? Mrs. Patterson has been coordinating our current food bank efforts, and I think she'd be thrilled to have your help in expanding the program. As Kate walked back to her apartment, her mind was already spinning with possibilities. She thought about story times for children while their parents shop for groceries. She imagined family game nights or cooking classes that would bring people together in a casual, friendly environment. She envisioned a program that would help families not just survive difficult times, but feel supported and valued by their community. That afternoon, Kate did something else that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. She walked over to the Johnson family's small apartment, carrying a bag of children's books that she had carefully selected from her personal collection at home. Sarah answered the door with surprise and pleasure. Kate, how nice to see you. Please come in. The apartment was small, but clean and warm, decorated with handmade Christmas decorations and filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. The children were playing on the living room floor with a collection of well-loved toys, and they looked up with excitement when they saw Kate. "I brought you some books," Kate said, offering the bag to the children. "These are some of my favorites from when I was young, and I thought you might enjoy them." The children dove into the bag with enthusiasm, pulling out classic picture books and beginning to flip through the pages immediately. But Kate noticed that Sarah looked uncomfortable, as if she wasn't sure how to respond to the gift. "Kate, this is so kind of you, but we can't afford to buy books right now, and I don't want you to think you need to give us charity," Sarah said quietly. Kate sat down on the couch next to Sarah, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, these books have been sitting in my apartment for years, not bringing joy to anyone. I would much rather see them being loved and read by children who will appreciate them. You're not doing me a favor by taking them. You're doing me one." She paused, thinking about how to explain what she was really trying to say. "Besides, after what you shared last night about gratitude and community support, I realize that I've been missing out on the joy that comes from sharing what you have with others. Giving these books to your children makes me feel like I'm finally being the kind of neighbor I want to be." Sarah's expression softened, and Kate could see that she understood. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was community support, the kind of mutual care that neighbors provide for each other. "In that case, thank you," Sarah said warmly. "The children love books, and these will be perfect for our Christmas Eve reading tradition." They spent the next hour talking about books, about children, and about the challenges of raising a family during difficult economic times. Kate learned that Sarah had been a teacher before her second child was born, and that she missed the intellectual stimulation of her career almost as much as the financial security. Sarah learned that Kate had always wanted children, but that her marriage had ended before that dream could be realized. As Kate prepared to leave, Sarah walked her to the door and said something that would stay with her for a long time. "You know, Kate, last night when you spoke at church, you talked about your daughter's thank you changing something for you. But I think you should know that your kindness to my children has changed something for me too. It's reminded me that there are still good people in the world who care about each other just because it's the right thing to do." Walking home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Kate reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She had gone from someone who avoided community involvement to someone who was actively seeking ways to contribute. She had gone from seeing her neighbors as strangers to be avoided to seeing them as potential friends and collaborators. Most importantly, she had remembered that isolation, while it might feel safer, was actually much more painful than the risks that came with caring about other people. Over the next few days, Kate threw herself into planning the expanded food bank program with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She met with Mrs. Patterson and Father William several times, sketching out ideas for family programming that would complement the basic food assistance. They decided to call it the Community Kitchen, emphasizing that it would be a place where people came together rather than just a distribution point for supplies. Kate suggested they start with a weekly family story time, where children could hear books read aloud while their parents had a chance to connect with other adults facing similar challenges. She also proposed monthly family game nights and seasonal celebrations that would give everyone something to look forward to beyond just meeting their basic needs. Mrs. Patterson was delighted with Kate's ideas and energy. "You know, dear, we've been running the food bank for 10 years, but it's always felt a little impersonal to me. People come in, get what they need, and leave. This idea of yours, creating more of a community space where people can build relationships, I think that's exactly what's been missing." As they planned, Kate found herself thinking constantly about the Johnson family and others like them. She wanted to create something that would provide practical support while also preserving dignity and building genuine connections. She remembered how awkward Sarah had initially felt about accepting the books, and she was determined that the community kitchen would feel like a place where people came to participate in community activities rather than just to receive help. The planning process also gave Kate a chance to get to know Mrs. Patterson better, and she discovered that the older woman had her own story of finding community after loss. Mrs. Patterson had moved to Millbrook 15 years earlier after her husband died, looking for a place where she could start over and find ways to make her life meaningful again. When I first started volunteering with the food bank, Mrs. Patterson told Kate during one of their planning sessions, I thought I was helping other people. It took me a while to realize that they were helping me just as much. Having a purpose, feeling needed, being part of something bigger than my own grief, that's what really saved me. Kate understood exactly what she meant. The work they were doing together was giving her the same sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from her life for so long. On Christmas Eve, exactly 4 days after the carol service, Kate was putting the finishing touches on the community kitchen program proposal when she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find a small group of her neighbors, including the Johnson family, Mrs. Henderson, and several other people she had met at the church. We hope we're not bothering you, Mrs. Henderson said, but we wanted to bring you something. They had brought her a beautiful homemade Christmas wreath decorated with pine boughs, red ribbon, and small handmade ornaments. But more than that, they had brought something Kate hadn't expected, an invitation to spend Christmas Day with them. Several of us were talking, Sarah Johnson explained, and we realized that we're all in similar situations this year. Some of us are far from family, others are going through difficult times, and a few of us are just tired of spending holidays alone. So we decided to have a community Christmas dinner at the church, and we'd love for you to join us. Kate felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at the group of people standing in her hallway. A week ago, she had been planning to spend Christmas Day alone in her apartment, probably reading and trying not to think about all the Christmases that had been different. Now, she was being invited to celebrate with a group of people who had become more than neighbors in the space of just a few days. I would love to, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for thinking of me. As the group prepared to leave, the little Johnson girl handed Kate a small, wrapped package. I made this for you, she said shyly. Inside the wrapping paper was a hand-drawn picture of the Christmas carol service, showing stick figures sitting in church pews with musical notes floating above their heads. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Mrs. Kate, for being nice to me." Kate knelt down to the child's level, holding the drawing carefully. "This is the most beautiful Christmas present I've ever received," she said sincerely. "Thank you for making it for me." After everyone left, Kate sat in her quiet apartment, holding the child's drawing and thinking about the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 4 days ago, she had been a woman defined by her isolation and her fear of getting too close to other people. Now she was someone with friends and plans and a sense of belonging that felt more solid than anything she had experienced in years. She hung the wreath on her door and placed the drawing on her refrigerator, where she would see it every morning when she made her coffee. Tomorrow, she would spend Christmas Day surrounded by people who cared about her, and in the new year, she would help launch a program that could make a real difference in her community. The transformation that had begun with a simple thank you at a Christmas carol service was continuing to ripple outward, affecting not just Kate's life, but the lives of everyone around her. And the best part was Kate realized this was just the beginning. Christmas Day in Millbrook dawned bright and clear, with fresh snow sparkling in the sunlight and the kind of crisp winter air that made everything feel clean and new. Kate woke earlier than usual, filled with an anticipation that reminded her of childhood Christmas mornings. For the first time in 5 years, she had somewhere special to be on Christmas Day and people who were looking forward to seeing her. She dressed carefully in her best sweater and spent extra time preparing a dish to share at the community dinner. She had decided to make her grandmother's famous apple crisp, a recipe she hadn't used since before her divorce. As she worked in her small kitchen, measuring ingredients and remembering her grandmother's patient instruction from years past, Kate felt connected not just to her neighbors in Millbrook, but to her own history and family traditions. The walk to St. Mary's Church took her down Main Street, past storefronts decorated with Christmas lights, and through the town square where snow had gathered around the base of the old monument. Kate noticed details she had never paid attention to before. The way the morning light reflected off the church's stained glass windows, the smoke rising from chimneys of houses where families were celebrating together, the peaceful quiet of a town taking a collective pause to honor the holiday. When she arrived at the church, Kate found the parish hall transformed into a warm, festive space that looked nothing like the formal community gatherings she had imagined. Long tables were covered with mismatched tablecloths and decorated with simple centerpieces made of pine boughs and candles. People of all ages were moving around the kitchen area, setting up a buffet of homemade dishes and talking and laughing as they worked. Father William greeted her at the door with a warm smile and a brief hug that felt completely natural. "Kate, Merry Christmas. I'm so glad you could join us today. This has turned out even better than we hoped." He gestured toward the bustling activity around them. What started as a dinner for a few people who didn't have other plans has turned into a real community celebration. We have 3 generations of some families here, people who just moved to town, others who have lived here their whole lives. It's exactly what Christmas should be. Kate looked around the room and saw familiar faces mixed with new ones. The Johnson family was there, with the children wearing matching Christmas sweaters that were clearly handmade. Mrs. Henderson was arranging flowers on the tables, moving slowly but with obvious pleasure in the task. The young mother she had met at the carol service, Jennifer, was there with her baby and what appeared to be her own mother, visiting for the holidays. But Kate also saw people she didn't recognize, including an elderly couple who looked somewhat uncertain about whether they belonged there, and a middle-aged man sitting alone at one of the tables, reading a paperback book while people moved around him. Sarah Johnson approached with a plate of cookies shaped like Christmas trees. "Kate, I'm so glad you made it. The kids have been asking about you all morning. How can I help?" Kate asked, setting her apple crisp on the dessert table. "Actually," Sarah said with a smile, "Mrs. Patterson had an idea that I think you're going to love. Since we have so many children here today, and since you're so good with kids, she wondered if you might be willing to organize some kind of activity for them after dinner. Maybe a story time or games, something to give the parent a chance to relax and talk with each other." Kate felt a familiar flutter of excitement at the suggestion. "I'd love to do that. I actually brought a few books with me, just in case." As people continued to arrive and the final preparations for dinner were completed, Kate found herself naturally taking on a role of someone who helped newcomers feel welcome. When she noticed the elderly couple standing somewhat awkwardly near the entrance, she approached them with the kind of gentle warmth that Mrs. Henderson had shown her at the carol service. "Hello, I'm Kate Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "I don't think we've met. I'm so glad you could join us today." The woman, who introduced herself as Dorothy, smiled with obvious relief. "We just moved here last month to be closer to our daughter, and we don't really know anyone yet. Father William invited us when he heard we didn't have plans for Christmas, but we weren't sure if we should come." "I'm so glad you did," Kate said sincerely. "I was new here not too long ago myself, and I know how overwhelming it can be. But this is exactly the kind of group where you can just be yourself and feel welcome." She spent a few minutes talking with Dorothy and her husband, learning that they had moved from a large city where they had become increasingly isolated after retirement. Their story reminded Kate of her own journey toward connection, and she made a mental note to introduce them to some of the other community members who might share their interests. When Father William called everyone together for dinner, Kate found herself seated between Mrs. Henderson and one of the teenagers she had noticed at the carol service. The conversation at their table ranged from stories about childhood Christmases to discussions about books and movies, from concerns about community issues to gentle teasing about cooking disasters and family traditions. But what struck Kate most was how natural it all felt. A week ago, the idea of spending Christmas Day with a group of relative strangers would have felt forced and uncomfortable. Instead, she felt like she was celebrating with an extended family, people who cared about each other's well-being and who were genuinely interested in each other's stories. During the meal, Father William stood to offer a brief blessing, but instead of a formal prayer, he spoke simply about gratitude and community. We're grateful today not just for this food and this warm space, but for the reminder that none of us has to face life's challenges alone. We're grateful for new friendships and old ones for second chances and fresh starts, and for the ways that opening our hearts to each other makes all of our lives richer. As people nodded and murmured their agreement, Kate thought about how perfectly his words captured what she had experienced over the past week. Opening her heart to community involvement had indeed made her life richer, not just in terms of activities and social connections, but in terms of meaning and purpose. After dinner, Kate gathered the children in a corner of the parish hall where someone had thoughtfully arranged cushions and blankets to create a cozy reading area. She had brought several Christmas picture books, including The Polar Express, which she had been reading to children at the library just weeks earlier. As she settled into the storytelling routine that had become second nature to her over years of library work, Kate noticed that she wasn't just reading to the children. Several adults had drifted over to listen, including Dorothy and her husband, who were clearly charmed by the way the children responded to Kate's animated reading style. But it was during the third story, when she was reading The Gift of the Magi to the older children, that something extraordinary happened. As Kate read about the young couple's sacrifice for each other, about love expressed through selfless giving, she noticed that many of the adults had stopped their conversations to listen. The story seemed to resonate particularly strongly with the parents in the group, many of whom were facing their own financial challenges this Christmas. When Kate finished reading, one of the fathers, a man she hadn't met before, spoke quietly. That story reminds me of something my wife and I've been talking about. We've been so worried about not being able to give our kids the kind of Christmas they're used to that we almost forgot about all the other ways to show love. His comment opened up a conversation among the adults about the real meaning of Christmas gifts, about finding joy in simple pleasures, and about the ways that community support could provide children with experiences and memories that were more valuable than expensive toys. Sarah Johnson added, "My kids have been talking all week about the Christmas Carol service and this dinner today. They keep saying this has been their best Christmas ever. Not because of anything we bought them, but because of all the people who have been kind to our family." Kate felt her heart swell as she listened to the conversation that had grown out of the simple act of reading a story aloud. This was exactly what she and Mrs. Patterson and Father William had envisioned for the community kitchen program, creating opportunities for people to connect with each other in meaningful ways, to share their experiences and challenges, and to discover that they were not alone in facing life's difficulties. As the afternoon continued, Kate found herself in conversation after conversation with people who wanted to learn more about her plans for the community kitchen. The elderly couple, Dorothy and her husband, were particularly interested in volunteering. Dorothy had been a school librarian before retirement and was excited about the possibility of helping with children's programming. Her husband had managed a small business and offered to help with organizational aspects of the food distribution. The middle-aged man who had been reading alone earlier turned out to be a recently divorced teacher who had moved to Millbrook to start over after his marriage ended. His story was so similar to Kate's that they found themselves talking for nearly an hour about the challenges of rebuilding a life after major loss and the courage it took to open yourself up to new community connections. Even some of the teenagers expressed interest in getting involved, particularly with activities for younger children. Kate realized that the community kitchen had the potential to become something much larger and more comprehensive than she had originally imagined. Not just a food assistance program, but a true community center where people of all ages could find support, friendship, and opportunities to contribute their own skills and talents. As the Christmas celebration began to wind down and people started collecting their dishes and putting on their coats, Kate felt a profound sense of completion. Not the kind of ending that closes a chapter, but the kind of completion that comes when you realize you've found your place in the world. Mrs. Henderson approached her as she was helping to clean up the kitchen area. "Kate, dear, I hope you know what a difference you've made in our community, not just today, but over this whole past week. Watching you find your place here has reminded all of us about the importance of reaching out to people who might be feeling isolated. Actually, Kate replied, I think it's been the other way around. All of you have reminded me about the importance of letting people reach out to you, of being willing to accept care and friendship even when it feels risky. As Kate walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, carrying leftover apple crisp and wearing a warm scarf that Mrs. Henderson had insisted she take, she reflected on the remarkable transformation that had taken place in her life. Less than a week earlier, she had been a woman who defined herself by her independence and her ability to manage alone. Now she was someone who was actively seeking ways to become more connected to her community, someone who had friends and plans and a sense of belonging that felt solid and real. The house where the Johnson family lived was glowing with warm light, and through the window, Kate could see them gathered around their Christmas tree, the children playing with simple toys while their parents sat together on the couch. It was a picture of family contentment that had nothing to do with expensive gifts or elaborate celebrations, and everything to do with the security that comes from knowing you're loved and supported. As Kate climbed the stairs to her own apartment, she found a small wrapped package outside her door. Inside was a hand-knitted bookmark made from red-end, green yarn, with a note that read, Dear Kate, thank you for making this Christmas so special for all of us. We're lucky to have you as our neighbor and friend. Love, the Johnson family. Kate sat in her quiet apartment, holding the bookmark and looking out at the snow-covered street below. Tomorrow, she would begin working in earnest on the community kitchen program. In the new year, she would start attending regular church services and looking for other ways to contribute to community life. She would continue building the friendships that had begun at the Christmas carol service and deepened during the community dinner. But tonight, on Christmas night, Kate simply sat in grateful silence, understanding finally that the thank you she had spoken at the carol service had been the beginning of a much larger conversation with life itself. She had been given the gift of community, the gift of purpose, and the gift of remembering who she really was underneath all the protective walls she had built around her heart. The transformation that began with a child's simple gratitude at the library and continued through a moment of vulnerability at a church service had created ripples that extended far beyond anything Kate could have imagined. She had not only found her place in Millbrook, but she had helped create space for others to find their places as well. As she prepared for bed, Kate made one final entry in the journal she had started keeping since the carol service. Christmas Day, she wrote, I learned that thank you is not just something you say to acknowledge a kindness received. It's also something you say to acknowledge a life well lived, a community well served, and a heart well opened. Tonight, I am thankful not just for what I have been given, but for who I have been allowed to become. The story of Kate's Christmas thank you was complete, but the life it had made possible was just beginning.